The cold morning air bit through every layer of cloth as the Red Army soldier crouched behind the shattered remnants of what had once been a factory wall. His hands trembled, though not from the cold. In his grip was something that Western observers had dismissed as primitive, desperate, even laughable. A simple metal can packed with explosives, magnets welded to its surface, a fabric cone trailing behind like the tail of a cheap kite. The RPG-483 anti-tank grenade, the sticky bomb that the British liaison officers had politely called crude during their visits to Soviet testing grounds. But on this frozen morning in late 1943, somewhere in the killing fields of Ukraine, crude was about to prove itself more than adequate. The German Panther tank rolled forward through the rubble, its massive form emerging from the smoke like a prehistoric beast. 50 tons of sloped armor and engineering precision, the pride of the Wehrmacht's armored divisions. Its 75-millimeter gun had already reduced 3 Soviet positions to smoking craters in the past hour. The crew inside felt invincible, and why wouldn't they? The Panther was considered one of the finest tanks ever designed, a mechanical marvel that had sent Allied planners into sleepless nights trying to figure out how to stop it. The young Soviet soldier, barely 20 years old, watched the monster approach. His commissar had given him simple instructions: wait until it passes, run to it, throw the bomb, run away if you can. Those were the orders that thousands of desperate soldiers received across the Eastern Front, because sometimes crude was all you had, and sometimes crude was enough. To understand how this moment came to be, we need to step back several years to a time when the Soviet Union was reeling from the most catastrophic military disasters in human history. June 1941. Operation Barbarossa crashed into the Soviet Union like a tidal wave of steel and fire. 3 million German soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and aircraft, poured across the border. The initial weeks were an absolute catastrophe for the Red Army. Entire armies were encircled and destroyed. Thousands of tanks were lost, knocked out by German anti-tank weapons, or simply abandoned when they ran out of fuel or broke down. The Soviets had numerical superiority in armor at the start of the war, but superior German tactics, training, and coordination turned that advantage into a liability. Within months, the Germans had destroyed or captured thousands of Soviet tanks. The tank factories in the western regions fell into German hands or were evacuated in chaotic retreats eastward. Soviet tank crews who survived the initial onslaught found themselves facing an enemy that seemed unstoppable. The German panzers, supported by deadly anti-tank guns and coordinated infantry attacks, carved through Soviet defenses with terrifying efficiency. But the Soviets had something the Germans didn't fully appreciate. They had depth, vast industrial capacity that could be relocated beyond the reach of German bombers. Factories in the Urals began churning out tanks, but in those desperate early months and years, there simply weren't enough armored vehicles to stop the German advance. Infantry had to find ways to fight tanks without tanks. This was not a new problem. Throughout military history, soldiers had struggled with the fundamental question of how a man on foot could destroy a machine weighing dozens of tons. The Spanish Civil War had provided some early answers: Molotov cocktails, improvised explosives, magnetic mines. But these were desperate measures requiring courage that bordered on the insane. You had to get close, terrifyingly close, close enough to smell the hot metal and engine oil, close enough to hear the crew talking inside. The British had their own experiments with magnetic anti-tank weapons. The sticky bomb, officially designated the No. 74 grenade, was developed in 1940. It was, in theory, a clever device. A glass sphere filled with nitroglycerin, covered in a sticky adhesive, surrounded by a metal casing. You'd remove the outer cover, revealing the sticky surface, then throw it at a tank. The adhesive would make it stick to the armor, and then it would explode. In theory. In practice, the British sticky bomb was a nightmare. The adhesive was so strong it would stick to anything, including the soldier trying to throw it. There were documented cases of soldiers getting the device stuck to their uniforms or equipment. The safety mechanism was unreliable. The glass sphere was fragile. And worst of all, even when everything went right, the explosive force was often insufficient to penetrate the armor of newer German tanks. British officers who saw Soviet anti-tank weapons in development or in early field use during their liaison visits often shared knowing glances. The Soviets were clearly desperate, they thought, throwing together crude devices because they lacked proper weapons. The Red Army's magnetic mines and shaped charge grenades looked primitive compared to British engineering. They worked sometimes, but at what cost? The casualty rates among Soviet anti-tank teams were astronomical. What the British didn't fully grasp was that the Soviets weren't trying to create perfect weapons. They were trying to create effective weapons that could be mass-produced, that required minimal training, and that could be used by soldiers who might have only weeks of military experience. The RPG-43, introduced in 1943, embodied this philosophy perfectly. The RPG-43 was simple, almost brutally so. A metal cylinder packed with 730 grams of TNT and a shaped charge. The shaped charge was the key innovation, a conical hollow in the explosive that would focus the blast into a jet of superheated gas and molten metal capable of penetrating armor. 4 magnets on the bottom would help it stick to the target. A fabric stabilizer cone would ensure it flew straight when thrown. Pull the pin, throw it, and get down. Simple, crude, deadly. The Soviet weapons designers weren't idiots. They knew the RPG-43 wasn't elegant. They knew soldiers would die using it, because using it required getting within 30 meters of an enemy tank, often much closer. But they also knew that a weapon that could be produced by the hundreds of thousands, that any soldier could learn to use in an afternoon, that required no complex sighting mechanisms or special training, was worth more than a sophisticated weapon that took months to manufacture and required expert operators. Soviet industrial output in the middle years of the war was staggering. Factories that had been dismantled and moved thousands of kilometers east were reassembled and began production within months. Tank production ramped up dramatically. The T-34, that workhorse of the Red Army, rolled off assembly lines at a rate that shocked German intelligence. But even with increasing tank production, the Soviets needed their infantry to be able to fight armor independently. Anti-tank weapons became a critical focus. The PTRD and PTRS anti-tank rifles gave infantry some capability at range, though these weapons became less effective as German armor improved. The RPG-43 and its predecessor designs gave infantry a close-range option. Molotov cocktails, satchel charges, and mines rounded out the arsenal. Soviet soldiers were trained in anti-tank tactics with an intensity that bordered on obsession because the alternative was being ground under the treads of German panzers. Training films and manuals hammered home the basics. Know your target. The engine deck was vulnerable. The tracks could be broken. The rear armor was thinner. Get close, strike fast, withdraw if possible. Accept that casualties would be high. Accept that this was the cost of stopping the German advance. And soldiers did accept it. Not because they were mindless fanatics, though that was how German propaganda often portrayed them, but because the alternative was watching their homeland be conquered, their families subjected to the brutal occupation that had already consumed so much Soviet territory. The Eastern Front was an existential war. Surrender meant imprisonment in camps where the death rates approached 100%. Occupation meant hanging, starvation, and systematic elimination. Fighting, even with crude weapons, even against impossible odds, was the only choice that made sense. By 1943, the tide of the war was shifting. though this was not yet obvious to many observers. Stalingrad had ended in a German disaster, with an entire army destroyed. Kursk would soon demonstrate that German offensive capability in the east had been broken. But these were massive strategic shifts that took months or years to fully understand. At the tactical level, German armor was still formidable, still feared, still deadly, and then the Panther arrived. The Panzerkampfwagen 5 Panther was Germany's response to the shock of encountering the Soviet T-34 in large numbers. German engineers had been stunned by the T-34's sloped armor and mobility. The existing Panzer III and IV models, while effective, were outmatched. The Panther was designed to be superior in every way. Heavier armor sloped like the T-34. A powerful 75mm gun that could destroy any Soviet tank at ranges exceeding a kilometer. Good mobility despite its weight. Advanced optics and fire control. The first Panthers entered combat at Kursk in July 1943, and despite mechanical problems that plagued the early models, the tanks demonstrated their potential. A well-positioned Panther could dominate a battlefield, destroying enemy armor before they could effectively return fire. Soviet tank crews learned to fear the distinctive silhouette of the Panther, its long gun and angular turret unmistakable even at distance. But the Panther had weaknesses. Its mechanical complexity meant it broke down frequently. Its weight made it less mobile in difficult terrain than the lighter Soviet tanks. And most critically, it was expensive and time-consuming to produce. Germany could never manufacture Panthers in the quantities needed to match Soviet production. For every Panther that rolled off a German assembly line, the Soviets were producing multiple T-34s and other armored vehicles. Still, encountering a Panther was a nightmare scenario for Soviet forces. Infantry anti-tank weapons that might damage or destroy a Panzer III or IV often proved inadequate against the Panther's armor. The RPG-43, with its shaped charge, could penetrate if the hit was clean and the angle favorable, but getting close enough to a Panther to throw one was extraordinarily dangerous. Which brings us back to that frozen morning in late 1943. The Soviet soldier, whose name has been lost to history like so many others, watched the Panther grind forward. It had separated from its supporting infantry, a tactical mistake, but one the crew probably felt they could afford. Panthers often operated with a sense of invulnerability, their crews confident that Soviet weapons couldn't harm them at any reasonable range. The tank was hunting, methodically destroying any position that showed resistance. The soldier waited. Patience was everything. Attack too soon, and the tank's machine guns would cut you down before you got close. Attack from the wrong angle, and the crew would see you coming and maneuver to engage. Wait for the right moment, the brief window when the tank's attention was elsewhere, and the geometry of approach provided some cover. The Panther fired again, its main gun thundering, and in that moment of noise and distraction, the soldier moved, not running, not yet. A quick scramble from the rubble pile to a crater, then another scramble to a destroyed building wall. The tank was perhaps 50 meters away now, its engine rumbling, its tracks clanking on the frozen ground. Closer. He had to get closer. Soviet tactics for close-range anti-tank attacks had been refined through brutal experience. You didn't charge directly at a tank. You used cover, you moved when the tank was distracted, you approached from the side or rear if possible. You worked in teams when you could, with one soldier drawing attention while another attacked. But sometimes you were alone, and then it came down to courage, timing, and luck. 30 meters. The Panther began to traverse its turret, scanning for new targets. The soldier pulled the pin on the RPG-43, feeling the mechanism release. The safety was off now. The grenade was armed. If he dropped it, if he was hit, if anything went wrong, it would explode. His heart hammered in his chest, his breath coming in short gasps that created small clouds in the cold air. 20 meters. close enough to hear the crew inside the tank, their voices muffled but audible. They were speaking German, words he didn't understand, but the tone was casual. They felt safe. Why wouldn't they? They were inside a Panther, the most advanced tank on the battlefield. 15 meters. This was it. Any closer, and the tank's machine guns could engage him, even if the crew spotted him at the last second. Any farther, and his throw might not be accurate enough. The soldier rose from his cover, drew back his arm, and threw. The RPG-43 flew through the air, its stabilizing cone streaming behind it, and struck the rear deck of the Panther. The magnets grabbed. The shaped charge aligned. The soldier had already turned to run, diving back toward the crater he'd used for cover. The explosion was sharp and focused, nothing like the thunderous blast of a larger bomb. A jet of superheated gas and molten metal penetrated the engine deck, punching through the armor and into the engine compartment. Fuel lines ruptured. Oil sprayed across hot metal. Fire erupted instantly, and within seconds, the engine compartment was an inferno. The Panther lurched to a stop. Smoke began pouring from the engine deck. Inside, alarms were sounding, and the crew could feel the heat rapidly building. The decision was immediate. Abandon the tank. The commander threw open his hatch, and the crew bailed out, scrambling away from the burning vehicle as ammunition began to cook off inside, small explosions popping and banging. The mighty Panther, that engineering marvel, that symbol of German armored superiority, sat immobilized and burning, taken out by what British officers had dismissed as a crude device, disabled at point-blank range by a single soldier with a weapon that cost a fraction of what the tank did. This was not an isolated incident. Across the Eastern Front, similar scenes played out thousands of times. Soviet infantry armed with RPG-43s, satchel charges, Molotov cocktails, and sheer desperate courage took on German armor. The casualty rates were horrific. For every successful attack, there were multiple failures that ended in the attacker's death. But the successes accumulated, and each destroyed or disabled tank was one less the Red Army had to face. The Germans tried to adapt. They added mesh screens to their tanks to defeat magnetic mines and grenades. They improved infantry support to prevent close approaches. They modified tactics to keep their armor out of close-range danger zones. But the fundamental problem remained. The Soviet Union could replace losses faster than Germany could. Soviet industry was outproducing German industry by increasingly large margins, and Soviet soldiers, for all the crude simplicity of their weapons, were learning and adapting with frightening speed. By late 1943 and into 1944, the Red Army was no longer the disorganized, poorly equipped force that had been mauled in the opening months of Barbarossa. It was becoming a sophisticated, well-equipped military machine. Tank production had reached levels that made numerical superiority overwhelming. Artillery had been massed in concentrations that made German defensive positions untenable, and infantry tactics, including anti-tank warfare, had been refined through years of brutal combat experience. The RPG-43 served throughout the rest of the war. Over 2 million were produced. Soldiers learned its quirks and limitations. They learned the optimal throwing technique, how to judge distance, how to approach different types of targets. They learned that the shaped charge needed to hit at the right angle to be most effective, and how to position themselves to achieve that angle. They learned because the alternative was dying without learning. Western observers began to revise their opinions of Soviet weapons as the war progressed. What had seemed crude began to look pragmatic. What had seemed desperate began to look effective. The Soviets weren't building perfect weapons. They were building weapons that worked well enough, that could be mass-produced, that could be used by soldiers with minimal training. It was a different philosophy than the Western approach, which often prioritized sophistication and individual weapon quality over mass production and simplicity. The British eventually recognized the value of shaped charge weapons. The Piat, or projector infantry anti-tank, used a spigot mortar to launch a shaped charge bomb. It was more sophisticated than the RPG-43, with longer range and no need for the suicidal close approach, but it was also heavier, more complex, and harder to use. Soviet soldiers throwing RPG-43s were achieving results that required specialized weapons teams in Western armies. The story of the RPG-43 and similar weapons is ultimately a story about adaptation, about making do with what you have, about fighting with whatever tools are available. It's easy, from the perspective of decades later, to focus on the major weapon systems, the tanks, the aircraft, the artillery, but wars are won by soldiers, and soldiers need weapons they can actually use in combat conditions. The Eastern Front was a war of extremes: extreme cold, extreme brutality, extreme casualties. It was a war where survival often came down to split-second decisions and desperate courage. The soldiers who attacked tanks with hand-thrown grenades were among the bravest, or perhaps most desperate, of all. They closed to ranges where they could see the faces of enemy crews through vision ports. They operated in the shadow of tank guns and machine guns, knowing that one mistake meant certain death. After the war, the Soviets continued to develop their anti-tank weapons, building on the lessons learned from millions of combat encounters. The RPG-7, introduced in the early 1960s, became one of the most widely used anti-tank weapons in history, serving in conflicts around the world to this day. It was a direct descendant of the same philosophy that produced the RPG-43: simple, effective, mass-producible, usable by minimally trained soldiers. The Panther, by contrast, became a museum piece. A few survive in collections around the world, impressive in their engineering, but also monuments to a losing strategy. Germany bet on quality over quantity, on sophisticated weapons that required skilled crews and extensive logistics. The Soviets bet on mass production, on weapons that were good enough, on overwhelming numerical superiority. History rendered its judgment at the gates of Berlin in May 1945. But beyond the grand strategic questions, beyond the debates about weapon design philosophy and industrial capacity, there are the individual moments: the soldier with the grenade, the burning tank, the crew scrambling to safety, their invincible machine reduced to scrap metal. These moments, multiplied thousands of times across years of combat, tell the real story of the Eastern Front. The British had laughed at the crude Soviet sticky bomb. It was an understandable reaction. To Western eyes, accustomed to more sophisticated weaponry and more systematic approaches to warfare, the Soviet weapons seemed improvised, desperate, inadequate. But crude doesn't mean ineffective. Sometimes crude means practical. Sometimes crude means it works when nothing else is available. That morning in late 1943, when the Panther sat burning and its crew stood in the cold, watching their tank become a bonfire, crude had proven to be exactly enough. The soldier who threw the grenade, if he survived the war, probably never knew that his actions would become part of a larger story. He was one of millions fighting in the largest and deadliest conflict in human history. His weapon was one of millions produced in factories that had been saved from German capture by desperate evacuation efforts. But in that moment, he represented something important. He represented the transformation of the Red Army from a force that had been nearly destroyed in 1941 to a force that would eventually march into Berlin. He represented the Soviet ability to adapt, to overcome, to turn industrial capacity into military power. And he represented the ultimate futility of German hopes for a quick victory in the East. The Germans had anticipated that the Soviet Union would collapse under the weight of the initial assault. They had studied Soviet equipment and found it inferior. They had observed Soviet tactics and found them crude. They had looked at Soviet soldiers and seen cannon fodder. They had been wrong about almost everything. Soviet equipment improved dramatically as the war progressed. Soviet tactics evolved through painful experience, and Soviet soldiers, far from being mindless masses, proved themselves capable of remarkable bravery and increasing skill. The crude weapons they carried in the early days of the war became more sophisticated, but the underlying philosophy remained: practical, mass-producible, effective enough. The RPG-43 was never going to win design awards. It was never going to be featured in glossy brochures about advanced weaponry. It was a metal can full of explosives with magnets stuck to it and a fabric cone for stabilization. By any measure of engineering sophistication, it was primitive compared to the Panther it destroyed. But sophistication is not the only measure of effectiveness. The RPG-43 did what it was designed to do. It gave Soviet infantry the ability to destroy enemy tanks at close range. It was cheap to produce, simple to use, and deadly when employed correctly. These qualities, rather than sophistication, turned out to be what mattered in the grinding attritional warfare of the Eastern Front. The war's progression tells the story clearly. In 1941, German forces advanced hundreds of kilometers, destroying or capturing thousands of Soviet tanks. By 1942, the advance had slowed. Stalingrad became a meat grinder that consumed an entire German army. In 1943, Kursk marked the last major German offensive in the east, and it failed. From then on, it was retreat. Slow at first, then faster, then catastrophic. At every stage, Soviet infantry played a crucial role. They held defensive positions that tanks couldn't reach. They infiltrated German lines to attack supply columns and command posts. They fought in cities where armor's advantages were neutralized. And they destroyed enemy tanks, using whatever weapons were available. The soldier who disabled that Panther was part of this larger story. He was one small thread in a tapestry of millions of similar actions. Each individual attack was tactically minor, but collectively, they represented a strategic problem for Germany that proved unsolvable. How do you protect your armor from enemy infantry when that infantry is willing to get close enough to throw explosives? How do you maintain the offensive when every advance means exposing your tanks to close-range attack? How do you sustain mechanized warfare when the enemy can destroy your vehicles faster than you can replace them? Germany never found good answers to these questions. Defensive measures like mesh screens helped, but didn't eliminate the threat. Improved infantry support reduced losses, but couldn't prevent them. And the fundamental math remained impossible. Soviet production exceeded German production. Soviet manpower exceeded German manpower. Soviet willingness to accept casualties exceeded German ability to inflict them at a favorable exchange rate. The crude Soviet sticky bomb, laughed at by British officers who saw it in development, became one of many tools that turned the tide of the war. Not through individual brilliance, not through superior design, but through mass production and widespread use. Soviet soldiers threw millions of anti-tank grenades during the war. Most missed. Many hit, but failed to achieve decisive results. But enough succeeded to make every German tank commander nervous about operating in infantry-heavy terrain. This psychological effect was as important as the physical destruction. A Panther crew that knew Soviet infantry might be lurking in rubble with anti-tank grenades would be more cautious, less aggressive, less willing to push into dangerous terrain. Caution meant slower advances, which meant more time for Soviet forces to prepare defenses, which meant fewer breakthroughs, which meant the strategic offensive stalled. In the end, the Eastern Front was won by a combination of factors: Soviet industrial capacity, harsh weather, massive territorial depth, improving military leadership, increasingly effective tactics, and yes, crude weapons that worked well enough. The RPG-43 and similar devices were small pieces of a much larger puzzle, but they were necessary pieces. After the war, military analysts in Western countries began to seriously study Soviet weapons development and tactical doctrine. What they found challenged many assumptions. Soviet weapons weren't crude because Soviet engineers were incompetent. They were simplified by design, optimized for mass production and ease of use. Soviet tactics weren't primitive because Soviet commanders were unsophisticated. They were adapted to the realities of total war against an enemy fighting for survival. The lessons learned influenced post-war weapon development. The value of simple, reliable, mass-producible weapons became more appreciated. The importance of infantry anti-tank capabilities was recognized more fully. The idea that sophisticated weapons weren't always better than practical ones gained traction. But these lessons came with enormous costs. The Eastern Front killed an estimated 27 million Soviet citizens. Military casualties alone exceeded 8 million. The soldiers who attacked tanks with hand-thrown grenades had mortality rates that defy easy comprehension. For every successful attack like the one that disabled that Panther, there were countless others that ended in the attacker's elimination before they could get close enough to throw. We remember the successes because they're dramatic and because they mattered strategically. We forget the failures because they were too numerous to count, and because the soldiers who fell in those failed attacks left no dramatic story. They simply ceased to exist, blown apart by tank cannons or machine-gunned before they could close the distance. This is the dark reality behind the story of crude weapons defeating sophisticated ones. Yes, the RPG-43 could disable a Panther, but the cost in human life to achieve each successful attack was staggering. Soviet commanders accepted these costs because the alternative was worse. Letting German armor roam freely across the battlefield would lead to even higher casualties and eventual defeat. Better to expend soldiers in desperate close-range attacks if it meant destroying enemy tanks. This calculus sounds brutal, and it was. But it was the calculus of total war. The Germans weren't coming to conquer territory or extract resources with some intention of eventual negotiation. They were coming to eliminate the Soviet state and population. The stakes couldn't have been higher. Every weapon that could destroy a German tank was valuable, regardless of the cost to use it. The Panther that burned that morning in 1943 was just one of thousands of German armored vehicles lost on the Eastern Front. Most were destroyed by Soviet tanks or anti-tank guns. Many broke down mechanically and were abandoned. Some were lost to air attack, and yes, some were disabled or destroyed by infantry at close range using crude weapons. Each loss hurt the German war machine more than comparable losses hurt the Soviets. Germany couldn't replace Panthers quickly. The factories that built them were vulnerable to bombing. The supply chains that fed those factories were increasingly disrupted, and the skilled workers who assembled them were being drafted into combat units to replace infantry losses. The Panther was a magnificent machine, but it was also a symptom of Germany's losing position. The Soviets, by contrast, were ramping up production of everything: tanks, artillery, aircraft, small arms, and, yes, anti-tank grenades. The factories in the Urals and Siberia were beyond the reach of German bombers. The workforce included millions of women who had replaced men sent to the front. The industrial infrastructure, once it had been relocated and reorganized, proved remarkably resilient. This disparity in production capacity meant that even if German weapons were individually superior, which was often true in the early and middle years of the war, they couldn't overcome Soviet numerical advantages. A Panther might be better than any individual Soviet tank, but one Panther facing 5 T-34s was going to lose. And if infantry with anti-tank grenades were added to the mix, the Panther's chances dropped further. The story of the RPG-43 is therefore not just about a weapon. It's about industrial strategy, military doctrine, and the human cost of war. It's about how desperation drives innovation, about how simplicity can be strength, about how courage and numbers can overcome technological superiority. It's also a reminder that war is not a clean exchange of capabilities on a spreadsheet. The British officers who dismissed Soviet anti-tank weapons as crude were making calculations based on peacetime logic. In their framework, A weapon that required users to approach enemy tanks at suicidal ranges was obviously inferior to weapons that could engage at safer distances. They were right, in a sense. If you could choose between a weapon that let you attack from 300 meters and one that required you to close to 15 meters, you'd choose the former every time. But the Soviets didn't have that luxury in the early years of the war. They didn't have enough anti-tank guns, didn't have enough tanks, didn't have enough of anything except soldiers and industrial capacity. So they built weapons that their soldiers could use, that could be produced in enormous quantities, that required minimal training and logistics. The RPG-43 fit these criteria perfectly. By the time Soviet industry had caught up, by the time they could have produced more sophisticated weapons in sufficient quantities, the RPG-43 had proven itself. It worked. Soldiers knew how to use it. It was integrated into tactical doctrine. There was no compelling reason to replace it, so production continued throughout the war. In the decades after the war, the RPG-43 was largely forgotten outside of specialist military history circles. It was overshadowed by more famous weapons like the T-34 tank, the Katyusha rocket launcher, or the PPSH submachine gun. But to the soldiers who used it and to the German tank crews who feared it, the RPG-43 was anything but forgettable. That morning in late 1943, when a single soldier disabled a Panther with a crude explosive device, represented the Eastern Front in microcosm, overwhelming German tactical advantages being ground down by Soviet numbers and determination. Sophisticated German equipment being destroyed by simple Soviet weapons. The slow, grinding, bloody process by which the Wehrmacht was pushed back toward Germany. The British officers who had laughed at Soviet weapons eventually gained a different perspective. As the war continued, as they saw Soviet forces push German armies back across thousands of kilometers, as they watched the Red Army liberate occupied territory and drive toward Berlin, the crude weapons looked less amusing and more effective. Results mattered more than elegance. In the final accounting, the RPG-43 was a success, not because it was sophisticated, but because it achieved its purpose at an acceptable cost. Millions were produced. They destroyed thousands of enemy armored vehicles. They gave Soviet infantry a capability they desperately needed. They contributed, in their small way, to the eventual Soviet victory. The soldier who threw that grenade, whose name we don't know, deserves to be remembered as much as any tank ace or decorated hero. He faced death at close range, armed with a weapon that many dismissed as crude and inadequate, and he succeeded. He represented millions of Soviet soldiers who fought with whatever they had, who accepted impossible odds, who died in numbers that still shock us decades later. Wars are not won by superior technology alone. They are won by soldiers willing to use whatever weapons are available, by industries capable of producing those weapons in necessary quantities, by commanders willing to adapt tactics to match capabilities, and by nations willing to endure costs that seem unbearable until you understand what's at stake. The Eastern Front was the largest and deadliest theater of the Second World War. It consumed armies, destroyed cities, and changed the course of history. In that vast conflict, small moments mattered. A single soldier with a crude explosive device could alter the tactical situation. Multiply that by thousands of similar moments, and the strategic picture shifts. The Panther tank was a masterpiece of engineering. The RPG-43 was a metal can with explosives and magnets. In a just world, the masterpiece should win. But war is not just, and victory goes not to the best designed weapons, but to the weapons that are actually available in sufficient quantities at the right time and place. On that frozen morning, crude defeated sophisticated, desperation defeated precision. Soviet industrial pragmatism defeated German engineering excellence. And one more Panther burned, one more small victory in a war of millions of such victories, adding up slowly to the ultimate Soviet triumph in the east. The British stopped laughing somewhere along the way. They watched Soviet forces push toward Berlin while their own advance from the west proceeded more slowly. They saw crude weapons achieving results. They learned lessons about weapon design, about mass production versus sophistication, about what actually matters in total war. And somewhere in the rubble of the Eastern Front, if he survived, a young Soviet soldier moved on to the next battle, carrying another RPG-43, ready to face the next tank. Because that was what the war required. Crude weapons, desperate courage, and the mathematical certainty that if you destroyed enough enemy tanks, eventually the advance would stop, then reverse, then become a rout. The story of the RPG-43 and the Panther is ultimately a story about how wars are really won. Not in single dramatic moments, though those exist. Not through technological superiority alone, though that matters. But through the accumulated effect of thousands of small tactical victories achieved at enormous cost by soldiers using whatever weapons they have available. Sometimes those weapons are crude. Sometimes they work anyway. And sometimes crude is exactly what's needed to get the job done.